We are all accustomed to the wonderful and very biblical truth that we cannot earn or merit our salvation, but that it is a divine gift of grace upon sinners. We are, if you will, justified by faith alone. And when we turn to the epistle of the Galatians, we automatically assume, more or less, that this is the crisis that caused Paul to pen his passionate treatise on justification. But are we safe in assuming this? Are Paul's opponents really exhorting the Galatian converts to start earning their salvation? Or is it much more specific than that? Well, in order to answer these questions, let us place our assumptions to the side momentarily and take a second look using Paul's cultural setting as a guide. A good place to start our journey is Saul of Tarsus. See, Saul, as a part of the sect of Pharisees within Judaism, would have basically been utterly devoted to maintaining Israel's collective devotion to Torah and the traditions of the elders. Devotion would be maintained through zeal, another way of saying the use of violence in order to bring about the long prophesied final revolution or reign of God, which would constitute Yahweh's return to Zion and the rebuilding of the temple, the cleansing of the temple, and the general resurrection of Israel and the restoration of the country, the forgiveness of sins, the defeat of oppressive Rome, Israel's elevation above the nations, the pouring out of God's Spirit upon His people, the new creation, and the incorporation of the Gentiles. As a zealous Pharisee, Saul knew full well this great age would not come about unless Israel kept Torah to Yahweh's great standard. So wherever Saul witnessed wholesale apostasy that threatened the coming revolution, he would curb it with the force of arms. This is precisely why he set out to persecute Christians who were urging the relaxing of Israel's key boundary markers such as circumcision, kosher law, and Sabbath. Moreover, we can't imagine how this new heretical sect fueled his zeal by proclaiming a crucified Messiah figure, which was nothing short of a contradiction in terms, as F.F. Bruce would say. Moving on, let us read Paul's so-called conversion in the book of Acts. It says, "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But arise, enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.'" Now, before we continue, it is imperative that we understand that this was not a conversion from Judaism to Christianity per se, as generations have erroneously taught. This is not the way Hollywood stars trade out Kabbalah for Buddhism as the next cultural fad. Judaism was more than an inward set of religious beliefs. It was a worldview that encompassed every facet of life, religious, social, economic, and political. Saul never changed views on the central tenets of Judaism, election of Israel, monotheism, and God's promise of a new creation. Rather, his Judaism was radically reshaped and transformed around Jesus as the Messiah. What changed is his view of where Israel's long story presently was at. No longer waiting for the coming age, for it had actually already begun at the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. All of Israel's cherished hopes had in one sense happened in the person of Jesus in advance. So it was now time to summon the Gentiles as equal covenant members in Christ. It was time to reunite Abraham's promised family. In one sense, the use of the term calling here is more apt in describing Paul's experience. Once Paul realized that new creation was underway and that his unique vocation was to call the Gentile nations from idol worship into obedience of the faith by proclaiming the gospel event, he set out on his missionary journey, accompanied by Barnabas as apostle to the Gentiles. Though fraught with difficulties, Paul was able to establish multiple churches throughout the Galatian region simply by proclaiming the message of the cross. It was through this message that God the Father renewed hearts and minds, bringing about reconciliation with His wayward creation. Soon, by God's grace, Both Jews and Gentiles were no longer at enmity. Instead, they worshiped the same redeeming God in Christ, fellowshipping as equal heirs to the new creation, and eating at the same table regardless of their cultural differences. See, this was too much for some back in Jerusalem who felt that Paul's gospel was a scandal, and that to allow Gentiles into the Abrahamic covenant as equal members without undergoing works of the law was to paganize the faith. How could one identify Abraham's family without Israel's national identity markers, if all appeared as pagans? So it must be Jesus plus Torah. It is this add-on that the agitators brought to the Galatian churches in order to complete Paul's so-called half-gospel. Paul, at this point previously, we need to understand this term, works of the law. Ever since the Reformation, this term has been more or less used to describe how human beings attempt by their own moral efforts to merit or earn their salvation. The first problem with this view, it is extremely vague, because Paul's opponents are not stressing just any work, but specifically works of the law, the Torah. This is important clarification to make, seeing if we revisit the Torah itself, it was given to an already redeemed people. Thus, as a way of getting, not so much as a way of getting in, but as a way of staying in. And some scholars call this covenantal nomism. Now remember, Deuteronomy states this to Israel, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the people on earth to be his people, his treasured possession." It was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his heart upon you and chose you, for you were fewest of all peoples. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. However, though we have clarified the controversy a bit, it is still possible to improve our accuracy with what is being asked of the Galatians. The agitators are not just pressing for any command of Torah, but specifically circumcision and Jewish food laws. Why? James Dunn states this: "What is significant here is that these two works, circumcision and food laws, were the very laws which became crucial boundary markers for Israel's attempt to maintain its distinctiveness within a wider Hellenistic world in the Maccabean revolt." And it is precisely this attitude which comes to expression in Galatians chapter 2. The obligation or works of the law as requiring Jews to separate themselves from others. First Maccabees states, according to the decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Therefore, we can conclude that the phrase erga nomu, or works of the law, is not a way of describing ambiguous human merit, but specifically how one identifies a Jew as a Jew, who is likewise an Israelite, thus a participating member of Abraham's family, someone you can eat with at the same table. Paul's argument throughout Galatians is the way one identifies fellow covenant members has switched due to the new creation inaugurated with the crucifixion, no longer works of the law, but simply by faith in Jesus. That is how we recognize each other as fellow heirs of the covenant and as promised children to the future new creation, the new heavens and the new earth.